StereoKit is for C# developers, especially those that don't have a lot of mixed reality experience. I really designed StereoKit to be very easy to learn. So like, I always imagine like, what if I was teaching this to students? Like, what would they think of this API? How difficult would it be for them to learn? But at the same time, it's also a very powerful API as well. So while it's easy to learn, it's also very expressive. So the idea is like, if you're a C# developer from enterprise or like not from necessarily game development or anything like that, you can just dive into this, learn it really easily, and start getting productive really fast. So it also helps to, because of the iteration time that StereoKit has, it's very fast to like just go through, try things, experiment a little bit. So it's also really good for rapid prototyping and iterating on your designs. So hopefully StereoKit is for everybody, but I focus mostly on these people who don't necessarily have experience with mixed reality before.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. It's super, super exciting. We are here today with the amazing presence of Roderick Kennedy, who is the founder of CMU and the creator of Teleport VR. And today he's going to delight us with an amazing presentation about that short, long history of the metaverse. Thank you so much, Roderick, for being here today. And the stage is all yours.
Oh, thank you very much. Now, can everyone see my presentation? Is that coming through? I guess I'll begin. So, this is a short, long history of the metaverse. I wanted to do this talk because I think some of the ideas in the metaverse go way, way back, longer than perhaps many people realize. And I think there's a lot to be learned from taking a look at where it all comes from. So the year is 1992, and a novel is released called Snow Crash, which describes something called the metaverse. And the metaverse is a virtual world. It is a place where you can enter in virtual reality, and you can work, you can live, you can make friends, socialize. And the metaverse in this novel is modeled as a 3D environment, as a sort of sphere with a single 100-meter wide street that encircles the globe that is in fact larger than the Earth. The novel was written by Neil Stephenson, and it's been inspirational to a great many people, particularly the people who are now building what we see as the metaverse. Now, if I can get excuse me, my PowerPoint is not responding, so I'm going to force it to change the page there. So Snow Crash in 1992. Let's rewind a little bit. In a cave in Greece, Plato originally proposed a sort of thought experiment. This is not right. Here we go. Now, was it Plato or was it Socrates? Because Plato tells the story. Socrates, we don't have his own writing. We only have what Plato and others have written about him. But it's called Plato's Cave. And the idea was that you would take some people, imprison them from childhood. Plato was full of these charming ideas. And they would be locked into a cave with a device that prevents them from turning their heads. All they would see would be shadows projected on the wall by, well, they didn't know what, but in Plato's conception, these would be performers with perhaps puppets who would use a great burning flame behind them to project the shadows of people, animals, and other things onto the walls of the cave. Now, this has been considered to be either a political allegory or an allegory for the process of philosophy, of freeing oneself from the constraints of perception. There are many different ways to look at it. In Plato's story, you would get a philosopher perhaps who freed himself from the cave, and he would go out into the real world and suddenly realize that the things he thought were real, the shadows, are not in fact reality, but that there's a whole world out there that is brighter and more real than what he thought was reality. He goes back to the cave and tries to explain this to the other people, but they don't want to listen. But what I think is interesting about this story is that from the first moment of philosophical thought that we have records of, we have the idea of presenting a view of something that could be taken for reality, but which is not in fact conventionally real. And that's coming from the very earliest times. Plato disagreed on many things with Aristotle, because Aristotle wanted to say that reality itself is observable and quantifiable and predictable, and we're not caught in an illusion in the sense that Plato's cave allegory is perhaps trying to tell us. Aristotle created laws of motion. They weren't correct, but they were actually pretty good approximations in dense media like water or air. Aristotle wanted to observe the world that was and not free himself from what Plato said could well be an illusion. Now, moving on to the 17th century, René Descartes had the thought that, well, what if we are in the cave? What if, as he put it, a malicious demon has employed its energies, he doesn't say how, but to deceive him, to make him think that he's a man, that he has hands, eyes, and flesh, and blood, and senses, but that he falsely believes these things. For Descartes, this was an idea that he needed to somehow disprove. It needed to be some way of getting around that in order to come to a true Christian understanding of the world with a benevolent God. So as this was going on in Italy, Piero della Francesca, a little bit earlier in the 15th century, was proposing the rules of perspective. this was part of the Renaissance, where people were, I guess, rediscovering the value of classical thought, thinkers like Plato and Socrates, Aristotle. One of Della Francesca's pupils was, in fact, Raphael, who painted the famous picture of the School of Athens in 1474, where you will find Plato and Aristotle arguing about the nature of reality. Moving on a little further, Isaac Newton was one of the first in the what we call the modern period to go against Aristotle's laws of motion and to come up with what he felt was more correct, because he'd observed, he'd made scientific observations and come up with some rules which were more accurate. The three laws of motion, and Newton's laws are equally wrong in many ways, but much more accurate and much more useful to our modern world. One of the implications of the Newtonian view, though, was that it was then thought to be possible that if you had enough information, you could simulate the world. You could perform the calculations with the correct initial conditions and come up with a prediction for how the universe would evolve, essentially simulation. And Charles Babbage invented the difference engine and drew up designs for a more complicated analytical engine with a view to, well, he wanted to solve mathematical problems, but his associate Ada Lovelace realized that it would be possible to use the analytical engine and the difference engine not just for solving mathematical problems, but to work on things besides numbers, to perform calculations about things that are not necessarily purely mathematical, but which we can find answers to if we had computing machines. Lovelace was actually commissioned originally to translate Babbage's lectures, which had been transcribed in French by an Italian, by a fellow called Charles Wheatstone, or Whitstone. And Whitstone was fascinated with stereoscopic vision, and in fact built some machines to provide 3D views of scenery, which he called the stereoscope. Stereo meaning a solid body, and scopion meaning to see. Moving into the modern age, we come to the creation of a worldwide network that encircled the globe and became capable of transmitting such information as Babbage's machine might be able to generate. The telegraph network, which between the middle of the Victorian period and the early 20th century came to connect Europe and America and Asia and Australia, and thus we entered the information age with the dawn of the telegraph. Moving on to the 20th century, we've now set the scene for the invention of the beginnings of what you might call virtual reality. This is a fairly little known work by a fellow called Green Peyton Wertenbaker in 1929. He called it The Chamber of Life. And it's a short story about a mysterious professor who takes the narrator into a room where he's created a device that will, by means of illusion, transfer that narrator to a fictitious land. The story isn't as well known as one that came after it, but it has a lot of similarities. by Stanley G. Weinbaum called Pygmalion Spectacles. And this is often cited as being the first proposal of something like virtual reality. Because he describes it, and there are goggles, a rubber mouthpiece. Weinbaum is essentially inventing in rough form something like the VR headset. And the world that his character is transported to is called not Metaverse, but Paracosmos. Now, in 1938, the French dramatist Antonin Artaud first coined the term virtual reality, or in French, la réalité virtuelle. And he was talking about theater. He was talking about a theater that he imagined far from the text-bound theater that he observed in the 20th century. He wanted to create a fully immersive theatrical experience. He wanted to create a theater of sound, of vision, that would transport and encompass the audience and free them from the sense of separation that he saw between audience and performance. And then in the 1950s, with reference to the world of art, Susanne Langer started to talk about virtual worlds and virtual spaces. She was particularly interested in sculpture, but what's interesting is here she starts to talk about the idea of haptics, of making tactile space visible and visual space tactile. And here we've set the scene really for what's going to happen in terms of technology in the next 10 to 20 years. A fellow called Morton Heilig, who was an inventor, a cinematographer, created some patents for what looks a lot like virtual reality goggles. He swiftly realized actually that the goggles that he was imagining were simply not feasible for his stereoscopic television in terms of the technology of the 1950s and the 1960s. He did build something called the Sensorama simulator, where a person would sit in the device, their head would be enclosed, and they would experience the stereoscopic vision of riding on a motorcycle through a city. And I can't say that it was a great commercial success, but Heilig very much was the pioneer of unusual displays, and it's certain that he had an influence on our next character. And this person is really the crux of a lot of what we're talking about. Ivan Sutherland was, or in fact still is, an inventor, an academic, an entrepreneur, and essentially the pioneer not only of 3D graphics, but of user interfaces, of rendering, and of virtual reality. And Sutherland imagined what he called the ultimate display, which in his essay of 1965 was essentially a room, something like what you would later see in Star Trek as the holodeck. But clearly Sutherland knew that the holodeck couldn't be built. So instead of that, he built this, the Sword of Damocles, essentially the first virtual reality or augmented reality goggles. And this had full motion tracking in the sense that where you looked, it was able to adjust the view. It only had a very simple vector rendering system, but it was able to know where you were looking and adjust the view for that. What's crucial about Sutherland is that he was the initiator of a great many of the technologies that have been so important in cinema, in television, in computer games, computer graphics, CAD, graphic design. But for all of these technologies that he was involved with, Sutherland started pretty much with virtual reality. Virtual reality was there from the beginning as the concept of what he imagined to be the end point of what he was building. Now, we come to 1975, and a gentleman called Will Crowther had two hobbies. He played Dungeons and Dragons, and he enjoyed caving with his wife, although they had just gone through a divorce. Will Crowther missed his kids, and he was looking to build something for them. Crowther worked at a company called BBN, and BBN, this being 1973, 1974, BBN was connected to the ARPANET. The ARPANET was the predecessor of the internet. TCP/IP had not yet been invented, but universities and organizations, particularly around America, were connected. And so Crowther built Colossal Cave Adventure, which is essentially an interactive story. You enter commands on a terminal, and the computer responds by telling you what's happening. Colossal Cave was saved on the BBN server as a file called Advent. And people around, particularly around the USA, found this file, opened it up, installed it on their own servers, tried it out, and enjoyed very much getting frustrated by the various puzzles in the adventure. So Colossal Cave had a lot of imitators. A lot of text adventures were then created, and one of the games that was made in its wake, which was released commercially, was called Zork. Now, Zork was played by these two gentlemen, Roy Trubshaw, Richard Bartle, at the University of Essex at the time. And Trubshaw and Bartle were inspired to create what they called the multi-user dungeon, which worked a lot like Colossal Cave or a lot like Zork, except multiple people could connect to the server at once and enter essentially a virtual world. So MUD, or MUD1, later called British Legends, was essentially the first online virtual world. You couldn't yet create an avatar, but it did at least ask you your name when you started, so it knew what to call you. And here we have the first map, or the map of the first virtual world, from September 1984 in a magazine. Someone had drawn out the locations that they'd created. And as you can see, there's certainly a lot of Tolkien influence in there. And like Colossal Cave, MUD involved a lot of golden treasure and more than a few angry dwarfs. Now, at about this time, in fact, in 1982-83, essentially TCP/IP was adopted, firstly by the US Department of Defense and later by universities and other organizations around the world as the standard networking protocol. And so we have essentially, in 1983, the birth of the internet. And 1 year later, William Gibson releases Neuromancer. Neuromancer is essentially the first major cyberpunk novel, the first major novel of what you might call the metaverse. He called it cyberspace, a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators in every nation, as he put it, or you could jack into the Matrix. Now, Gibson's cyberspace was not exactly the same as what we would later call the metaverse in Neil Stephenson's work, because the idea of the matrix in Neuromancer is it's not a simulated world, it's the actual network itself. Now, this is only a year, remember, after the internet started, essentially, but Gibson was proposing that the endpoint of the worldwide network would be a direct neural connection into the very data and network itself that would be represented to the user in 3 dimensions. In the same year, a company called VPL was founded by Darren Lanier and others. VPL research popularized the expression virtual reality. Now, it's not at all clear whether Lanier got the term virtual reality indirectly from Antonin Artaud. He probably doesn't remember whether it was coined by him himself or whether it was from somewhere else. We just don't know. The idea behind VPL was, well, what if computers were running all the time, interacting with the world, embedded with the world? What would the interface for that look like? And they built the interface. They built the data glove, and the headset was actually called the iPhone. Now, VPL didn't succeed because right at the time when they were doing this, we were just coming to the dawn of what would be, I guess, the dominant form of user interface for the network for the next 30 years, being the World Wide Web. Now, in 1992, finally, we come back to Snow Crash. Neil Stephenson creating the Metaverse, as he called it. And as with Gibson's work, what he envisioned was a futuristic dystopia where the metaverse was somewhere that you would almost escape to because real life was not, in fact, all that pleasant. Nonetheless, people want to build it, including Neil Stephenson. And what do we mean by the metaverse? Well, it's got to be 3-dimensional. It's got to be immersive. It's got to have a shared common virtual space. We don't say metaverses. We don't say a cyberspace. It's the matrix, cyberspace, the metaverse, the oasis. It's got to be one network, just as we have one internet. That's the goal. That's the idea. Meanwhile, Tim Berners-Lee was creating the World Wide Web. He was at CERN, and he was not building a system to allow people to jack into the matrix. He was not building a system for commercial use. He was building something to allow scientists to share information. It was by no means the first attempt at networking information. Obviously, we've spoken that the internet was already in existence. Since 1983, ARPANET preceded that. People had been sending emails in the 70s. However, by creating these two technologies, HTTP and HTML, Berners-Lee had created a super low overhead, low maintenance way for the world to get networked. And obviously, as we now know, that exploded. Barely 5 years later, and only a couple of years really after the World Wide Web had become popular, Dave Raggett, Mark Pesce, and others proposed VRML. And this was explicitly an attempt to extend the World Wide Web to support platform-independent virtual reality. It was an attempt to build a metaverse. That's what it was for. It was intended to be an HTML for VR. Some people called it a solution in search of a problem. In particular, the media writer Clay Shirky said that, well, VRML, initially he said that VRML is probably a few dozen years off being actually useful, but later he changed his mind. And what changed his mind was Quake. And what was interesting to Shirky about Quake is that although it was built for games, once you've got a world modeling protocol as he saw it, you've got spaces, you've got movement, objects, avatars, even simple physics. Once you've built all that, you can use it for so much more. So for Shirky, game technology offered a way forward in a sense that VRML really didn't. And indeed, in 1996, people started to build multi-user dungeons, MUDs, in 3D. The first was Meridian 59, released by 3DO in 1996. It was pioneering, but not all that popular. You're no doubt familiar, however, with World of Warcraft, released by Blizzard. And what was interesting about World of Warcraft is not so much what it did as a game, but the fact that people would start to go there to hang out with their friends. They would go there just to spend time there. And that did not go unnoticed. In 2003, the company Linden Labs was founded to create Second Life. And Second Life was like a massively multiplayer online game, except there was no game there. Second Life was built to be a metaverse, or a prototype for what the metaverse might be. It wasn't much used in virtual reality. Most people used it from the desktop, but in Second Life, we have the prototype of everything we imagine a metaverse could be. You would create an avatar. You could interact with people. You could run a business. You can create content and, in fact, own content in Second Life. And Second Life is still going. But the metaverse returned with a vengeance when Ernest Cline wrote Ready Player One. What's interesting about Cline's book, coming as it does 20 or so years after Neuromancer, 20 years after Snow Crash, is Cline's metaverse, called the Oasis, explicitly is a game. It was built as a game, but becomes the metaverse that people work in, play in, meet their friends, go to school in. And the influence of Ready Player One can't be discounted, because also in 2011, a very young man named Palmer Luckey created the Oculus Rift. And Luckey, I think, was inspired not only by Snow Crash, but also later, I think, by Ready Player One. And Ready Player One indeed became the inspiration for a great many of the people at Facebook. And in 2014, Facebook buys Oculus and enters the metaverse. And they were quite clear about their ambitions. Mobile is the platform of today. We're getting ready for the platforms of tomorrow. Mark Zuckerberg wanted to create the metaverse, and he was quite clear about this. So in 2021, as if it wasn't clear enough already, Facebook becomes Meta. And the company is absolutely committed now to being the metaverse company. But, well, what is it that we're all actually building? The virtual reality and metaverse pioneer, Tony Parisi, has set out 7 rules for the metaverse. Rule 1 is there is only one metaverse, and that's key, because if you're creating a lockdown closed system, it's not the metaverse, it's just a closed system. The metaverse is for everyone. Nobody controls it. No one company, no one organization. It's open. It's hardware independent. It's a network. And finally, which will take some explaining, it's the internet. What he means by that is not that it actually is the internet or that the internet is the metaverse. It isn't. What Parisi means is that the metaverse can become the three-dimensional interface to the internet itself. And I think these are probably rules that I would agree with. So we have a number of stabs now at what the metaverse might look like, but they're all closed systems. Meta Horizon, VR Chat, Neos, Rec Room. They're closed and they have proprietary standards with some open features. They are immersive, but how do you get from one to the other? How do you go from Horizon to VR Chat? How do you go from Rec Room to Roblox? So we're certainly not there yet. What about WebXR? The web has been such a powerful and successful technology that it's easy to imagine that we will base any metaverse on it. And this was the idea behind VRML, also the idea behind WebXR. But the web was built for one purpose, and it's not metaverses. The web was built for websites. The web was built for HTTP, HTML documents to be transferred efficiently and to produce good web experiences, productive web experiences. There are lots and lots of workarounds to make the web do what you might want it to do to produce the metaverse, and WebXR is part of that. But it was seen quite early on, and this is going back to 1997, that if something like VRML was to succeed, it needed its own protocol. It needed a real-time protocol. And researchers at the Naval Postgraduate School proposed VRTP for this purpose. Now, as VRML faded away, so also did VRTP, and we were left with either proprietary technologies or with using HTTP for something that HTTP wasn't designed for. Reaching the present day, this is how I would imagine the metaverse working, and I don't know if you would agree, but the only thing you run on your device could be a metaverse browser. The browser connects using a metaverse protocol, and the app or the site lives on the network. There are no downloads, there are no installations, and you can hop from site to site and even run multiple sites simultaneously. So it's composable, it's open, and anyone can build a part of it just by building a server, just as you can build a web server. Does this follow the rules? Well, there is only one. Well, if we had a protocol that was open, then yes, there would be one metaverse, just as there's one web. It's for everyone because anyone can build a server. Nobody controls it. It's open, it's hardware independent, and it is a network. And so that, I think, could be the interface to the spatial internet. And we've actually prototyped that at CIML. This is our own contribution to what we think could turn into the metaverse. You just boot up the browser. It's not a web browser, it's a metaverse browser. You type in a URL or you follow a portal, you press the connect button, and you're in the site. It's automatically multi-user, and it's open. Anyone can build a server, and the server doesn't have to be predicated on any particular technology. That's the way I think it'll look, because we're not there yet. I'll do a quick summary because we're 39 minutes in. What I want to say is that from the dawn of history, from the dawn of recorded thought, the concept of the virtual has been with us. and that virtual worlds do address fundamental ideas in human experience. This isn't something that we've just come up with in the 20th and 21st centuries. From the start of computing, from the start of 3D graphics, and from the start of the internet, the metaverse has been a goal that people have looked towards. Even before we talked about it as the metaverse, before we had a word for it, this was something that people had in mind. We're not there yet. We have certainly solved many of the fundamental challenges. The long history continues. Well, that's all I have, but I'm happy to take questions or arguments, points of interest or disagreement. Diana, what do you think?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well? I'm super excited about your presentation. Thank you so much. I really want to highlight a couple of things, and is your initial approach into the philosophical idea of why, from the beginning, men started to wonder about these possibilities, and wondering about actually the existence itself of humans, and
Yes.
what is our place here with this experience that we call reality. I really love it, especially when you spoke about the Chamber of Life. I've never heard about that. That was pretty interesting. And when you showcase the work that Ivan Sutherland has done with the work of Damocles, I also learned a lot from this. Amazing. I really would like to have a copy of the of the materials if possible. Amazing. So, but yeah, of course, there are a couple of questions. The first one is, why do you think that we're not using a Metaverse browser yet? Like, we know that big companies are pretty much kind of leading this process, but why they are not even taking, that direction when they seem to have the possibility? And really, I appreciate the work that you did. This is one of the most amazing things of this event, is that we get to understand and know people that is farther ahead like you. Thank you so much.
Oh, not at all. To address your question, why are we not using a metaverse browser? And I think this is absolutely fascinating. The web has been so successful. It has been so powerful in its transformation of the world we live in over the last 30 years, with such a simple conception, the idea of hypertext. Now, hypertext wasn't invented in 1989. It goes way back to the 60s, 70s, I think, as a concept. But HTTP and the idea of a REST protocol, they work together so well to deliver so much that it's the danger of a good idea, because you start to believe that the web can do anything. It's so good at what it does do, and what it does do is so all-encompassing that it's very easy to believe that what we need in terms of spatial computing will arise out of that. But you have to address the fundamental questions of, is it the right technology? Is it the appropriate technology? Now we have an internet, and the internet, as I say, predates the web by some years, and it has a number of protocols. It has the email protocols, which even predate the internet itself. It has protocols like FTP and real-time protocols, which I think, if we're to look at this dispassionately, we would see that in order to build something like a metaverse, we need to have widely adopted, shared real-time protocols. But it's so hard to see past the success of the web, because it has been just so successful. I think we almost need for the web to fail in some ways before we can get to that point where we say, well, hang on, maybe we need to take a step back from this. there are protocols that we can really use for this. WebRTC, UDP, RTP, and those are appropriate. HTTP for downloading single static files of data. But let's not try to push a square peg in a round hole, is what I'm saying. And I think it's going to take some time for people to come to that conclusion. There are amazing things, don't get me wrong, that you can do with WebXR and have been done with WebXR, and some super smart people working on that. But I think there's a lot of use cases where we just need to take a step back and say, if we want a metaverse, we have to have a metaverse protocol. And this is something the VRTP guys at the Naval School knew in 1997. Since then, obviously, the web has advanced and has gained some real-time features, a great many real-time features. But still, there's a fundamental paradigm there that the technology combination of HTML, HTTP is just really great for transmitting documents. And it's always going to be focused on that as it develops. So for metaverse, for spatial computing to become a first-class member of the internet, as I think we'd all want it to be, it needs to have its own stack.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I truly believe that it seems that in technology, we tend to carry on as new possibilities arise, methods or ways that has been done before. So apps and bringing into headsets in the same way that it was with cell phones, without thinking about the wider perspective of how we can make something that is more accessible for anyone. So the Metaverse browser is something that also I didn't hear particularly before in the way that you explain it, and it's something that we really invite the conversation to join you at Teleport VR and to learn more from you, because this is absolutely a great talk to have. And I believe that as more people from the industry start to have this type of conversations about ethics in XR, about what is really the metaverse and how we can actually guarantee accessibility for everyone, this is how it starts, with us starting to the conversations around this. Thank you so much. Is there anything that you wish to add right now, Roderick?
Nothing to add, except that I really love feedback, and I really want to carry on the conversation. Mm-hmm. So my LinkedIn is there, website, and please don't phone me, but catch me on LinkedIn, and happy to discuss with anyone who's interested.
Amazing. I'm following you on LinkedIn already, and I'm going to be reaching out for potential future conversations and speaking events. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your presentation. So with that, we finish then, and thank you so much for being here today. Let's go into the next presentation. Bye for now.